As I'm sure it is with most Canadians, my knowledge of the Ukraine Russia conflict and its historic roots is minimal, but I do know this. The situation is not as simple as Western governments and the government press are leading us to believe. It's not simply a matter of Russia invades Ukraine, therefore Russia is the aggressor and must be stopped. The background is far less simplistic. It's a background of ethnic rivalries, dubious election outcomes, shifting borders, foreign interference, money laundering by the Obama Biden administration and Ukrainian oligarchs, and failed diplomacy. In short, it's a quagmire. Very few here in North America fully comprehend, and we would be best to stay out of the conflict, in my personal opinion. Ukraine is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a guiltless victim here. And our own governments share much of the blame for what is currently unfolding in that area. And while I'm no expert when it comes to the geopolitics of that particular part of the globe, we're lucky to have someone here who knows a far sight more about the issue than many. Welcome, Celine. Could you please shed some light on what is happening today between Russia and Ukraine?
Thank you, Robert. Yes, we are in the third or fourth day of the conflict that began in Ukraine. And we are in the midst of the fog of war. But we need to step back enough so that we can frame this discussion of ours in the context of history. Context, as I've always said, Robert, is important. Without context, there is no understanding and no explanation. So, yeah, I mean, this is not about Putin, the Darth Vader, which is what the Western media and the Western government, particularly the United States and its allies in Europe, Great Britain, the BBC and others are portraying the situation as, and Ukraine, the victim. Of course, the people of Ukraine are the victims. Yes. You know, they are as much of a victim in this geostrategic chessboard as we have been the victim, that is the people in Canada, the Western world, around the world, in the 2 years of mandates and COVID regime and so on and so forth. So yeah, the people of Ukraine are victims. But here is this point, victim of whom? And that's the story that we need to discuss, because you know the media narrative is the Ukrainians are the victim of the Darth Vader, that is Putin, and Russian violence, Russian authoritarianism, or Russian, you know, whatever way they want to describe Russia as. And this is why we need to step back. Let me, Robert, right at the outset, as you and I begin this discussion, point out that as we are speaking, this month, February 2022, marks the 50th anniversary of President Nixon going to Beijing, you know, that open United States relationship with China. This is at the height of the Cold War. 72, and President Nixon's traveling to talk with Mao Zedong, visit Beijing after over 20 years of isolation in which Beijing was not represented. The Chinese were not represented. Mainland China was not represented at the UN. And after this visit, you know, China took the seat in the UN, and the nationalist Chinese, which is in Taiwan, they were unseated. So we have to bear that in mind because of what has happened as a result of what we are witnessing. The second is October of this year will mark the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what the Cuban Missile Crisis was about is being replayed right now. So there is a direct connection in that sense, historic connection, and a connection to understand between both those landmark events, which is the 50th and the 60th anniversary this year of Nixon's visit to China and the China opening, and the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis that happened. Okay, I want to begin, as you certainly have many questions about this matter, but I want to begin this by reading to you and to our viewers a couple of passages, few sentences from George Kennan. George Kennan was the father of the containment strategy that was implemented in the Truman administration at the end of World War II. Remember, at the end of World War II, Soviet army was occupying Berlin. Germany was divided. And the famous line of Winston Churchill that an iron curtain has descended from the Baltics to the Adriatic. The Iron Curtain, in effect, divided Europe between East and West, between Soviet armies right in the heart of Europe and the Western armies led by the United States standing on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And so the policy for the next 50 years almost that shaped our world between the end of World War II, 1945, and the collapse of the Soviet Union in early 1990s, almost half century, that world that was shaped, in effect, the intellectual and diplomatic and historian, as a historian, the godfather of the containment strategy was George Kennan. George Kennan's life spanned the entire 20th century. He was born in 1904. He died in 2005. He served in the Foreign Service as a young man between the two world wars. And then during the World War, that's the Second World War, he was the US consul in Moscow. And later he was the US ambassador and chairman of the Policy Planning Division in the State Department. It was his memorandum from Moscow that was later published in Foreign Affairs Journal as the X article is the foundation of the containment strategy. So what does George Kennan have to say towards the end of his life? You know, he was not a hawk. He was a diplomat. And he was a historian of Russia, modern Russia. So as he witnessed the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the revolution that swept through Eastern Europe, beginning with Poland, Lech Walesa, Solidarity, you know, in 1980, and eventually the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, 1992, to be exact. It was December of 1991 that Boris Yeltsin took power and Gorbachev left. So George Kennan's words are extremely important because the issue that we are faced with, or that the world was faced with, is what has triggered this crisis. And this is what George Kennan says. You know, he says, I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War. That is the policy that the Western powers under George Bush, the senior, then subsequently Bill Clinton and George Bush 43, that was the expansion of NATO eastward. That's what he's referring to. And he was witnessing it and he was cautioning about this, you know, from his vantage point and his knowledge and his history and his participation in all of the key issues of the 20th century vis-a-vis Soviet Union. So he says, I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. This expansion, which is the expansion of NATO, this expansion would make the founding fathers of this country turn over in their graves. We have signed up to protect a whole series of countries, even though we had neither the resources nor the intention to do this in any serious way. NATO expansion was simply a light-hearted action by a Senate that has no real interest in foreign affairs. Then he continued, what bothers me is how superficial and ill-informed the whole Senate debate was. I was particularly bothered by the references to Russia as a country dying to attack Western Europe. Don't people understand? Our differences in the Cold War with the Soviet communist regime. And now we are turning our backs on the very people who mounted the greatest bloodless revolution in history to remove that Soviet regime. And to conclude this from his long remarks, I'll read the final sentence. And Russia's democracy is as far advanced, if not further, as any of these countries. He's referring to Eastern European countries, Poland, Hungary, Czech, etc. As any of these countries we have just signed up to defend from Russia. It shows so little understanding of Russian history and Soviet history. Of course, there is going to be a bad reaction from Russia. And then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you that is how the Russians are, but this is just wrong. He was so prophetic.
It was a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Absolutely, absolutely. He died in 2005. Things have became increasingly difficult and worse by the actions of the United States government. In other words, by the action of the Uni Party. So when George Kennan is saying this, towards the end of his life, he has heard President Bush 41 talking about the New World Order to a joint session of the Congress, which most of us around never paid any attention to or never understood when we came across those words. What did George Bush 41 mean by the New World Order? And George Bush 41, Chief of Staff, Secretary of Defense, and later on the Vice President in George Bush 41's son's administration, George Bush 43, this is what it meant. This is what Dick Cheney said. New World Order is going to be what we now know, the new liberal rule-based order. In other words, one world globalism. And this is how Dick Cheney defined it. Let me read it to you and to our audience. We are an empire now. Just think of the arrogance. This is exactly what Kennan was saying, that the founding fathers will be turning in the grave. We are an empire now. And when we act, we create our own reality. And while you are studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We are history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do, what America do. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant the bipolar world was gone. That is, the world divided between East and West Bloc country. And the Great Division was the heart of Europe at the end of Second World War, 1945. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's only one power, the United States of America. It is the empire, to use the word of Dick Cheney, and it's going to be the liberal rule-based order. Both Democrats and the Republicans have invested into this, and what rule-based order means in just effectively in a sentence, we make the rule, you follow that rule. And if you don't follow that rule, you will be made to pay a price. You will be eliminated. Okay. So in the fog of the 1990s, none of this was clear because the world became absorbed. That is, we, the people, were given the narrative and the fact that the decade of the 1990s opened with Saddam Hussein occupation of Kuwait, around which the UN coalition was formed by the United States, to which Gorbachev joined also, when Gorbachev in the Soviet Union had been the backer of Saddam Hussein throughout the career of Saddam Hussein, and as is today Syria and so on. So, but Gorbachev joined George Bush. That was a reference to the New World Order. Canada was there. And so the decade of the 1990s, the world was given the picture of the rule-based order, pushing out Saddam Hussein, and all of that went about. But there was something else happening. And what was happening was, the new world order taking shape in Europe. And now that is pretty clear. What was the new world order taking shape? When the Berlin Wall collapsed, remember, Soviet Union is still the superpower in terms of military weapons and nuclear power, not economic power, but military power. That's always been the role of Soviet Union as a superpower, military power. No one was following Soviet Union in terms of culture, civilization, democracy, economic, and so on. But it was the superpower. If Mr. Gorbachev and the Soviet leaders wanted to maintain their position vis-a-vis this new world order that was, at that time, nobody was clear, but the notice was being given, they could have crushed Poland's revolution, Solidarity Revolution. That's what Kennan is referring to. The most peaceful revolution in world history in 20th century, the last part of 20th century, had happened that brought down the Soviet Union. Gorbachev could have moved the army into Poland. Khrushchev moved the army into Hungary. Brezhnev crushed the Prague Spring in 1969. And the Western power just, conceded to that and in effect recognized that that's the Soviet sphere of influence. That's the Iron Curtain. There are spheres of influence of great powers. So that could have been done. Gorbachev could have crushed it. In fact, instead, Gorbachev's entire career, from the time that he met President Reagan in Helsinki and negotiated with President Reagan, the whole idea of a balanced approach to what Gorbachev had dedicated himself to, that is glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost was the opening of Soviet Union to the West. Perestroika was the restructuring of the Soviet economy, okay? And so to carry on glasnost and perestroika, Gorbachev was open to the West. The European powers were open to the West at that time. They didn't want, a collision taking place between what the promise of glasnost and perestroika was for the Russian people and for the Europeans, a new dawning of the age. And it is in that context the Berlin Wall came down. It was heroism on the part of the German people, that is the East German people, the young people who took, the sledgehammer to break the wall. But the difference was the East German army, the Stasi, and of course, the might of the Soviet army stood aside and allowed that war to be smashed down, just as they allowed Lech Walesa, peaceful revolution, that Solidarnosc, to succeed. It was not a one-way thing, always people forget, in this geostrategic chessboard or in relationship, there are more than one actor. So in the discussion, this is a long discussion, but again, to put it in a very tight capsule, in the early 1990s, Gorbachev visiting the European powers, and then after Gorbachev left, Boris Yeltsin, who became the president, engaging with Western powers. Who were the Western powers? In France, it was Francois Mitterrand. In Germany, it was Helmut Kohl. In Britain, Maggie Thatcher had stepped down, or she was ousted by a palace coup among the conservative leaders, and John Major was the prime minister. So the two nuclear power country, and third, the economic powerhouse of Europe, Germany, Kohl, Mitterrand, and Major, they promised to Boris Yeltsin in very clear terms that NATO will not expand 1 centimeter, those are the words, will not expand 1 centimeter east of Germany. Moreover, the Germans made commitments to Boris Yeltsin that East Germany now united with West Germany. However, NATO forces, German forces, will not be positioned in East Germany because East Germany's border is with Poland. Poland was a Warsaw Pact country, So those were the assurances given. And then subsequently, when Europe with Moscow sat down to construct what became the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, it was made clear by both parties that security in Europe is indivisible. In other words, you cannot have security for the European states by creating insecurity for Russia. Indivisible. However, what happened, which is what recently Vladimir Putin in his address before the Ukraine crisis began, or the military operation began, pointed out, what happened was from middle of the 1990s, American power kept humiliating Russia. It began with the bombing of Belgrade, which was Russia's ally. Serbia, former Yugoslavia, The bombing of Belgrade, there was a massacre taking place. There was ethnic war taking place, But it had to be the Europeans to resolve it if they wanted to resolve it. But NATO went in, again, pushed by the Americans, went in. And the Belgrade incident, in which the Chinese embassy got bombed as a result. And the excuse was, well, there was a misdirection, a navigational error, the GPS went wrong. But in Belgrade, the Chinese embassy was bombed with cruise missiles, okay? So, that's the beginning of the humiliation. The beginning of the humiliation, despite in 1994, the Budapest conference took place, and a Budapest Memorandum of Understanding was signed by United States, that is Bill Clinton, by United Kingdom, that is John Majors, and by Moscow, Boris Yeltsin. And what was the signature about, the memorandum about? It was the position taken by these nuclear powers, Britain, United States, and Russia, that's the new Russia now, Russian Federation, post-communist Russia, that nuclear-powered countries like Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, former Soviet republics, should hand over their nuclear stockpile and sign the non-proliferation treaty. And the guarantee that was then given was that the sovereignty and security of these states, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, would be guaranteed by these three nuclear powers, Britain, United States, and Russia. So Putin was not there. This is the 1990s. This is within 2-3 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But with the Belgrade events, and then subsequently after Boris Yeltsin was gone, and Putin came in the early 2000s, the situation that they confronted in Moscow was all of those guarantees and promises that had been given to Gorbachev and to Boris Yeltsin was being systematically undermined, subverted, and destroyed from the perspective of Moscow. 14 Warsaw Pact countries, that is from the Baltic to the Adriatic, in the words of Winston Churchill, were turned over or brought into NATO. And so the two countries that were left, and they were willing, and Clinton and then George Bush and then Obama were pushing for to extend it, would be Belarus, Ukraine. Kazakhstan is, in the east. It's an Asiatic country. And so that was the push that began. And the resistance, therefore, from Moscow. That is the current context, which escalated over time. But here you might, put this again in terms of geostrategic chessboard. Every great power have their sphere of influence. That's what a great power is. It has a sphere of influence. So let's talk about that briefly. United States in the early 1820s, to be exact, 1823, President Monroe, who was the 5th president of the United States, one of the founding fathers, he proclaimed what is known as the Monroe Doctrine. What is the Monroe Doctrine that he proclaimed in 1823? He said, and this was directed to the European powers, particularly the great European powers who had a presence in the New World. Britain was in British North America, we Canada, Britain as and United States had fought a war in 1812. John Monroe was there. So Britain, France, and Spain, even though France had been an ally of the United States during the Revolutionary War. But Spain was basically the dominant power in South America, from Mexico down into Argentina and so on. The other one was Portugal in Brazil. So the Monroe Doctrine basically proclaimed that no outside power will be tolerated or accepted by Washington engaging or pursuing their interests detrimental to the interests of the United States. This is the Western Hemisphere. Okay, so 1823 Monroe Doctrine clearly laid out the policy of where is America's interest in the Atlantic Basin, and they will not tolerate it. After the Civil War, the position was very clear. Britain had supported the Confederacy. America would not tolerate Britain's engagement in any form or shape. That was the context in which very rapidly Johnny MacDonald and others got together to establish the Dominion of Canada so that they could, in some ways form a security basis for British North America, north of the 49 parallel. But it was also a message clearly to the Spanish Empire. Florida was still part of Spain, as was Mexico and so on, and the line was drawn. But the line comes into operation very sharply, as I said at the beginning of the discussion, and this is the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet missile placement in Cuba, and John F. Kennedy raised the Monroe Doctrine as a reminder, putting Soviet missiles 90 miles away from the American coastline, south of Florida, was a massive intrusion and a threat to American interests and a security. I mean, a missile pointing to Washington was not going to be accepted by Americans and was not accepted by Americans. And they drew the quarantine and they went almost mano to mano in what became the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev was the premier and successor of Stalin. Now, why had Khrushchev done that? Well, Khrushchev had done that because the Americans had put missiles in Turkey. Turkey was on the border of the southern republics of the Soviet Union. All of the countries surrounding the Caspian Sea and Black Sea are in border with Turkey. Plus, Turkey holds the critical passage from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, which is in the Black Sea. Crimea is the base of the Soviet fleet and the only warm water port. So the Americans had put, NATO had put missiles in Turkey. So on the geostrategic chessboard, Moscow responded by preparing to place missiles in Cuba. And when John F. Kennedy drew the quarantine around Cuba, Khrushchev understood. The Soviet Navy approaching those quarantine lines in the Caribbean turned around. The conflict was avoided. Soviet missiles was removed. And similarly, the missiles in Turkey was removed. It's clear. There are spheres of influence. That is what the discussion was in the early 90s. And that's exactly what George Kennan was alluding to. When you're pushing the NATO boundaries right into the face of Moscow, Moscow basically as a very weak power at that time, Soviet Union had collapsed. They had been humiliated. But mind you, the collapse of the Soviet Union was primarily from within, that the Soviet collapse meant the Russian people had risen up against communism. And as I would tell my students, if you guys don't read Solzhenitsyn, you will never understand 20th century history.
Isn't it ironic, Salim, that when the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian hegemony at the time, rejected communism, at the same time, here in the West, we've adopted a globalist communist ideology through the World Economic Forum, the Club of Rome, the United Nations, people like Chrystia Freeland, who studied Russian literature in the Soviet Union, in the Ukraine under the Soviet Union, who was badgered by the KGB at the time. And maybe she holds some sort of long-held animus, grudge against Russia for badgering her at that time, who knows? But the irony is that we've had Russia and the East reject communism, mostly, and the West adopt it. So the irony should not be lost on anybody familiar with politics. And you sent me an article on Substack by a Mark Walk. And he goes through a lot of the history and the ethnicities and cultural background of Ukraine, Russia. His last sentence in his article is very telling. And he says, the US did the people of Ukraine no favor when we meddled in their affairs in order to use their country as a base for pressuring Russia to bend to the knee of globalism. So people out there, not the Trudeaus and all that, they know what's going on, but they don't say it. The CBC, the CTV, the CNNs, they don't say it. But what is happening to the astute students of history, like yourself and this Mr. Wahb, is that we see the bigger picture of hegemonies, of global ideologies battling it out. And right now, that battle is playing out in Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. Ukraine is at this moment the hotspot, and we are entering a pivotal point, or we have already entered, and what is happening is the clash has taken place, and we are witnessing it between the pushback on the one side by Russia, which is the people of Russia led by Putin. And though the globalist media, it is not simply that, the position has been exchanged. Now the West, as you just pointed out, has become globalist communist in that sense, and Russia, gone through the revolution that it went through, is now a nation state in that sense of the term, and defending its people. So they are nationalists. They're not seeking an empire. That is the narrative that is being painted by CBC, CTV Global in Canada, and Globe and Mail, and that's the narrative of BBC and the mainstream media in the United States, New York Times, Washington Post, and all of that. But people who have memory and people who understand are not going to be deceived. And you just mentioned Mark Walk's writing that you have quoted. Mark Walk is the generation. He's a lawyer by profession, a legal expert, but he worked in the counterintelligence division of the FBI in his early career. So he's a man in his late 70s, early 80s, and so on, maybe even older. I don't have the chronology exactly in my head. But he's the man who was instrumental in exposing and ultimately led to the disclosure, arrest, and incarceration of Robert Hanssen, who was one of the top guns in the FBI, counterintelligence also, who became a double agent, who became a Soviet spy. It was Mark Walk who exposed him, and later on, Robert Hanssen was arrested, tried, and has been put away for life imprisonment, consecutive life imprisonment, I think, over a dozen times, so the man is not going to come out where he's been incarcerated. So people like Mark Walk, and there are a whole lot of other people who understand, who understand what is the play of people like George Soros and other media oligarchs like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates in the making of this globalist agenda. And the World Economic Forum, now interesting that you refer to Chrystia Freeland. She's a critical player. She is on the board of trustees of the World Economic Forum, and she is the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada and Finance Minister. How is it that a woman, a politician, a Deputy Prime Minister sitting on the board of trustees of the World Economic Forum can be holding the critical cabinet position in Canada? Where is the conflict of interest? Nobody's asking that question, because the media is entirely what used to be the mouthpiece, the media is the mouthpiece of Stalin and the communists in Moscow, that is Pravda and TASS, you know. Now the media in North America is the mouthpiece of the globalists. You cannot trust anything what the media says, you know. The media doesn't report objectively. The media is not free. There are not many voices in the media. Voices like yours and mine would not have a moment standing in the media, even though, you know, we know everything that the media does. As you know, I was a weekly syndicated columnist for the Sun Media for over 15 years, till, you know, I was told that it's over because my writing did not run to the needs of the globalist media. So this is the situation we are in. Our school system, our institutions, our academia, they are all controlled by the globalist agenda, in which to be politically correct means not to question the globalist agenda. If you are in any way politically incorrect, you will be censored, you will be removed, or even worse things can happen in terms of the way we are heading into a social credit digitalized economy where, you know, you can be sitting and suddenly you begin to starve with your children because you have no access to your money. You know, the banks freeze it and takes it away, which we saw during this play with the Emergencies Act, right? So this is the situation we are in. But back to Ukraine and Russia, that is the context that has to be kept in mind, you know. And so we can rapidly go into what happened to Ukraine in this period after 1990. Well, what happened to Ukraine? Ukraine became the playground of the globalists, of the deep state, of the uniparty. I mean, just take this into account, you know, one little fact that is simply the tip of the iceberg. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, that means the woman who's third in line to become the president, Biden, the president, John Kerry, who is Biden's climate czar, that means he is carrying the agenda of the World Economic Forum and the UN agenda, who was the Secretary of State in the second administration, second term of Obama, you know, 2013 to 2017. And Mitt Romney, a rhino through and through, a globalist through and through, who's now a US Senator, who was a candidate, therefore the uniparty candidate for the 2012 election, along with Paul Ryan as his running mate, another globalist who ended up being the Speaker in the Congress, and who showed his hand by opposing Trump administration while he was the Speaker. So here you have four key people, and there are many, many more, but just these four key people who are right now in Washington, holding power: President, Speaker of the House, former Secretary of State, and the climate czar in the present administration, and Mitt Romney, a senator. They and their children are deeply immersed with the Ukrainian oligarchs in making money. The Hunter Biden story was never investigated and never brought out. In fact, it was used in a way to destroy President Trump. During the presidential debate in 2020, when President Trump raised the issue of the Biden family connection with Burisma, and Burisma is again the tip of the iceberg, the answer that Joe Biden gave in the debate was that this is all basically lies, because the 17 intelligence agencies had examined what is being alleged and found this was Russian disinformation. And Chris Wallace, conducting the debate, basically turned the page on that line of questioning, So it was all a setup. So here it is, Ukraine became a playground, and a playground for the deep state and the West to turn Ukraine, to push it in the direction in terms of expanding NATO, a dagger right at the throat of the Russian Federation, Moscow. Just as no precedent in the United States, and it was John F. Kennedy who happened to be the president at that particular moment, no precedent in the United States would accept or allow, unless they are part of the globalist cabal, would allow, accept that Cuba or any of the Caribbean island be turned into the hostile base of a power outside the Western Hemisphere. No Russian president will accept that a dagger be drawn at his throat and encircle Russia. But it began with the Obama administration, 2009. I mean, there's the famous picture, of Hillary Clinton, who became the Secretary of State for Obama after having lost the candidacy to Obama in the 2008 primary. So she became the Secretary of State. And soon after Obama's inauguration in January of 2009, and Hillary Clinton being sworn in as the Secretary of State, she flies off to Moscow. Putin is the president at that time. He will step down soon after because he has served his 2 terms, and then it would be Medvedev who would become the president for 2 terms, and then Putin would return. But at that time, he was the president, and his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, who is, by the way, his foreign minister now. And in that famous meeting in Moscow between Hillary Clinton and Sergei Lavrov, Hillary Clinton offers Lavrov this big yellow disc with a button on top of it. And Lavrov is wondering, what is this? And she points the finger, at the button. This is the Great Reset. Press the button. So the Great Reset. The Great Reset was the World Economic Forum agenda already proposed and written, And so the word was not simply an accidental use of the word. The point of the Great Reset is that the empire, as Dick Cheney defined America after the collapse of the end of the Cold War, collapse of the Soviet Union, will be bringing about the new liberal rule-based order, which, by the way, Canadians are signed on to. That is both the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party and the NDP. This new liberal-based order is the globalist agenda. This is the agenda of the champagne-drinking socialists who fly their private jet planes to Davos. Davos and the World Economic Forum is the clearinghouse of the agenda, the packaging of the agenda, whether it is UN Agenda 2030, the climate change, global warming agenda, the Compact on Global Migration, on and on, the whole list of it. So this is the clearinghouse. And there, the oligarchs of the world, the Jeff Bezos, the George Soros, the Bill Gates, the Warren Buffetts, the Rothschilds, and so on and so forth, they recruit their own foot soldiers to carry out that agenda. And the governments of the world simply is going to take those policies and implement them. So that's what it is. We make the rule, you follow the rule. right? So there was the Secretary of State in Moscow, trying to ensnare and bring in Russia into this new rule-based order. The question one might ask before we proceed further on the Russian angle, what about China? Well, that's exactly what had already happened. China, through the World Trade Organization, had been brought into this system in which the Western powers, and particularly the United States, beginning with George Bush the senior, 41, and then carried out through to Clinton and George Bush, 43, into Obama. So that's almost 26 years, 20 quarter century, the process of shifting the supply chain and the production from the heartland of America to China that took place, and that shift was sold on the idea that in helping China make economic development under this arrangement, we are helping China to become a liberal democracy. The whole idea, the liberal democracy, Jeffersonian democracy, will be planted in China through this mechanism. Well, what happened was the deindustrialization of the West, particularly the United States. So that is the other side of this agenda. So in 2009, you have Hillary Clinton with Putin and Lavrov trying to get the Great Reset on. And the threat is Ukraine. The Ukraine will be brought in to the NATO, will be brought into the EU. And Mr. Putin is saying no. I mean, that's not Mr. Putin saying no, that's Gorbachev said no, it's Boris Yeltsin said no, it is the Russian people saying no. And that's why Putin happens to be, unlike what is the media narrative in the West, that he is the Darth Vader, he's the great Lucifer. It is the opposite. It is the opposite is that Putin is reflecting the interests of the Russian people, the deep-seated patriotism of the Russian people. Putin has revived and reestablished the Russian church, the Orthodox Church. Moscow is the third Rome or the second Rome, whichever way you want to put it. So none of this is to suggest that suddenly, Putin is a Jefferson or a Washington. The point is, as George Kennan said, that the progress, the evolution of Russian democracy is no less than the effort of democratic institution building in other Warsaw Pact countries. And to denigrate Russia is to humiliate Russia. And there will be a pushback. And that's the pushback we are seeing. But in 2009, what was happening was that in the 2004-2005 election that had happened, there was the color revolution, the orange revolution, It was in a sense a peaceful revolution, but John McCain and a whole lot of Americans were there who instigated this color revolution, supported this color revolution, gave money for it and so on. And the candidates in that election, 2004, was a man by the name of Viktor Yushchenko and Viktor Yanukovych. So there were two rounds of election. There's a runoff. And in the runoff election, Viktor Yanukovych was defeated. The matter is very hazy in terms of, vote count, regularities, and so on and so forth. But Yushchenko became the president. Yushchenko was more in the internal division of Ukrainian politics, was more leaning towards NATO and EU. And Viktor Yanukovych was leading towards Moscow, given the history of Ukraine, which is, of course, a very complicated history. Ukraine became part of the Soviet Empire going back to Catherine the Great in the early 18th century, 1700 and something, and remained part of the Russian Empire through the Soviet period. You know, Khrushchev was a Ukrainian who succeeded Stalin. And there is immense mixing of Russian people with Ukrainian people, intermarriages and so on. And there is, again, also Russian population on the borderlands, eastern borderlands, western borderlands for Russia, eastern borderlands for Ukraine, of Russian-speaking people. And part of the region, which is the Don Basin, Donbass region, which the two breakaway republics that Putin recognized before the military action started. Donetsk Republic, self-proclaimed, and then Luhansk, self-proclaimed republic. Moscow immediately recognized them, that is, Putin recognized them a week ago. These are a heavily Russian populated area, you know, they're Russian speaking people. So there is that internal division, and that was played out in the 2005 Orange Revolution when Yanukovych was declared the loser. And then when Yushchenko's term of office ended, Viktor Yanukovych ran again in 2010. He won that election, but in the re-election of 2014, he won that election again in 2014 in January. Again, it could have been rigged election. It could have been, you know, all sort of dirty tricks. You know, that is the corrupt nature of Ukrainian politics at the moment. And Yanukovych, having won that election, there was an uprising, what is called the Maidan uprising or the February uprising in 2014. And once again, the Americans were deeply involved in it. But that uprising of 2014 turned bloody. There was casualties, over 100, close to 200. The numbers are not clear in my mind right now, but those are the figures that have been cited. People died in the clash between pro-Russian and anti-Russian Ukrainians. And Yanukovych was in effect ousted in a sort of a political coup. He fled, and there was a warrant for his arrest put out by the Ukrainians. I don't know exactly where Yanukovych is, but possibly he fled to Moscow. And following that ouster of Yanukovych, Putin basically demanded and created a plebiscite in Crimea. And in that plebiscite or referendum, over 95% of the people in Crimea, where the main fleet, Russian naval fleet, is located, Sevastopol, voted to join Russia, and Crimea then became part of Russia. So that, again, is the background. And all of this was happening with Mr. Obama as the president, and now the Secretary of State was John Kerry, basically did nothing. If they were going to do anything, they did nothing in terms of, you know, what were they going to do to stop this happening? Well, they did nothing. There was no military option. And Mr. Putin acted in a manner he acted to protect Russian interests in the region. So in 2016 election, Hillary lost. Hillary was deeply compromised in terms of her personal money laundering, pay-to-play schemes. Not only she was deeply compromised in Ukraine, she was also deeply compromised in Russia. After all, Putin had paid big sums of money to Clinton and Clinton Foundation. And there is that notorious event in which Bill Clinton goes to Moscow and gives a 25-minute speech for which Putin's people hand him $500,000. So these are people deeply compromised, and so when these people try to lecture Moscow and Putin about democracy and transparency, it is as the Antichrist lecturing a faithful believer, whoever that faithful believer is, about, God's laws. They have no standing. They have no ethical and moral standing in this part of the world. And their agenda is very clear. They're pushing, using Ukraine as their playground and pushing into the heart of Moscow. Now, what have the Ukrainian leaders done? Ukrainian leaders, from Yushchenko and before him and after him, the man who took power after Yanukovych was ousted and fled, Poroshenko, these are the people representing the oligarchs of Ukraine who have been buying protection for themselves by paying American leaders. Okay, that's the backstory. And then comes President Trump, 2017 to January of 2021, last year, and nothing happened. There was no push for Ukraine into NATO, and there was no push from Putin threatening NATO. What happened was President Trump, in calling Zelensky, the current president of Ukraine, when Zelensky got elected in 2019, President Trump called him to congratulate him. And in that telephone conversation, he asked Zelensky that there's been a lot of problem in our country. And in all of that problem, Ukraine stands out. So can you please investigate and let us know about it? And the reference was made to CrowdStrike. That is the company, IT company that was used by Hillary Clinton to wipe out her server, which had been hacked, and 30,000 email, according to WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, was in their hand that the Russians had. CrowdStrike was a Ukrainian company that was used by Hillary Clinton. And so President Trump made reference to CrowdStrike. These are all now in public document because all of this was released. And he also asked Zelensky about what is happening with Burisma, what happened with the prosecutor general who was appointed, that is Shokin, to investigate Burisma. Would Zelensky investigate into that and let them know? And he said that that Trump said, we can send you my friend, my man. He's the mayor of America. He's very well informed in all of these matters, Rudy Giuliani, and you can advise him. Well, it was from within his White House that is these deep state people who monitored the phone call and who came out whistleblowing. The man was Colonel Windman, a Ukrainian American, saying that President Trump was using President Zelensky, that was his interest, to use President Zelensky to target his political opponent in America, that is Biden. And that became then the basis of the impeachment, the first impeachment that Nancy Pelosi drew up against President Trump. You see? So the backstory is that on the issue of Ukraine, in those 4 years, President Trump wanted, disclosures and transparency and an understanding of what was involved, that Biden came back at the end of Obama's term in office, 2016, and the tape is all around. We've all seen that tape where Biden is sitting and boasting in this Council of Foreign Relations, I believe it was, or Brookings Institution, one of the two.
Council on Foreign Relations.
Council of Foreign Relations, boasting that, and he's looking at his watch, mimicking what he did, that he was looking at his watch. He called the president's office and told them that you have 1 hour. If you don't fire the prosecutor general, you will not get the money.
I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting $1 billion. I said, you're not getting $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I looked, I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired.
So this is the backstory. And so what happened when President Trump leaves office in January of 2021, barely a year ago, we are back in the same play. We're back in the play of bringing Ukraine into NATO and putting the pressure and making the play such. In the game of chess, there is this term called Zugzwang, where you position the opponent in such a situation on the chessboard that the opponent has a legal move to play. It is not a stalemate, it's a legal move the opponent has to make. But whatever move the opponent makes is against the opponent's interest. That is, the opponent is going to be defeated. That's the Zugzwang. And in effect, the opponent is led to resign on the chessboard. So here was the Zugzwang. Whatever Putin does, it will fly against him. That is, on the one side, putting pressure, the argument, Ukraine is an independent, sovereign country. It has the right to make its own foreign policy and to engage in its own security interests. And therefore, the application of Ukraine to enter the NATO and for America to bring Ukraine into NATO and extend the NATO frontiers right into the heartland of former Soviet Union as Russia will play out. So what is Putin going to do about this? Putin either concedes, or as the pressure mounts, Putin has to act as what he did, and whichever way he goes, he is going to be depicted as Darth Vader, the bad wolf. You've gone into the backyard of the bear and you're abusing the bear, you are throwing, all sorts of things at the bear, and finally the bear will growl at you and come out. And that's exactly what happened. That's the Zugzwang that has been played. Now, what about the other European partners in this matter? Well, the more distant you are, that is Great Britain, you're got your special interest with America, with Washington, and you are the new rule-based order. We make the rule, you follow. Great Britain is part of the rule-making in that sense. And so Great Britain is all together with Biden on this matter, Boris Johnson and the entire British deep state and the British elite. But look at France before we look at Germany. France, we need to, again, contextualize. France going all the way back to Charles de Gaulle when NATO was created in 1949-50. France joined NATO because that was a France that was soon after the war in a different situation. But when de Gaulle became the president in if I remember correctly, 58, during the Algerian crisis, and when he ended that war and withdrew France from Algeria, France took the position that France will be part of the European defense, but it will not be a member of NATO. It was not going to be. France will pursue its own foreign policy. And France, has its own ambition as a great power. And France is a nuclear power. So France stepped out of NATO. France is not a sitting member of NATO from de Gaulle to now. So Macron, as this crisis was building up in the recent phase, he goes to Moscow. And he comes back from Moscow after meeting Putin. And he basically says that it is time for the European states, and the reference is to OSCE, Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, that was created after the fall of the former Soviet Union, says to build up its own defense forces for its own security. So it was not going along aligned with Biden's position on NATO, because France is not a sitting member of NATO, though France may be allied to NATO. So now we come to Germany, the powerhouse, economic powerhouse. And Germany has no interest, given the post-war history of Germany, to engage in a manner in which, though West Germany became a member of NATO, but now with unified Germany, to engage in any manner that is going to rupture its relationship with Russia. Germany has its own interest as a former great power and with a long history of Berlin-Moscow relationship, despite the war during Hitler period. Okay, but increasingly, Germany has become dependent on energy supply from Russia. So Nord Stream 2, the latest addition to the pipeline that has been built and is operating, is one of strategic importance to Germany's economy, and through Germany's economy to the rest of the European that the pipeline goes through. Okay, and they are not in any way willing to disrupt that energy issue, and they're not in any way willing to disrupt any of the financial mechanism in international finance with Russia, because so much of German interest is located in Russia. And so Germany has, in the recent development and discussion, Germany has refused to go along with Biden's suggestion to cut off Russia from having access to international banking through the mechanism of SWIFT. Okay, and Russia and Germany has refused to, turn off the tap on Nord Stream 2. Okay, so and it becomes more complex, because one of the things that the 4 years of President Trump was to develop American energy resources and become not only completely independent of imported energy, America, but America would become, by the time President left office, a net exporter of energy, and that energy was going to be offered to Germany, and President Trump told the Europeans very clearly that, if you want NATO, then you have to contribute to NATO. And when he was asked, what would you do, that is America do, if any member of NATO is threatened, would you come to their defense? And President Trump is on record saying, no, unless you guys make your contribution. And Germany hasn't made its contribution. Germany has not come up to the NATO agreement of making 2% of the GDP. Canada hasn't. Germany hasn't. France doesn't have to do that, because France is not sitting on the table in NATO. So the fact of the matter is that if it is the question of European defense, and the Europeans are not going to contribute and build up and defend themselves, then what is America's national interest to send American men and women to die in Ukraine or in the Baltics. So this is the globalist agenda. The agenda is to use American men and women and of its allies to establish that new liberal base order. And Putin has said no to that. China has said no to that. India has said no to that. Those were all evident in the recent vote in the Security Council on the censure of Russia on Ukraine. Russia, of course, vetoed it, the resolution. It is a veto holding power, one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. China abstained, a clear signal of where China's interest is. India abstained because India is now one of the 15 members in the Security Council at this time. And UAE, representing the Gulf states, the oil producing states, OPEC, abstained. So you can see there is a new realignment that is coming together, brought about by the crisis over Ukraine. It was already there under the radar because the 2009 Great Reset of Hillary Clinton went nowhere in terms of Putin. And now these votes have indicated that what was under the radar is now very much present to anybody who wants to examine them, of the realignment that is taking shape. So my opening observation, reminding people that this is the 50th anniversary, as we are speaking, of the opening to China by the United States, was precisely to try, in terms of geostrategy, to triangulate the Washington, Beijing, Moscow rivalry and confrontation. By opening up the relationship to China, President Nixon moved China away from Moscow. Remember, this is the height of the Cold War. Despite the rivalry between Moscow and Beijing, they're both communist power. And the Americans, as a leader of the Western Bloc countries and non-communist countries, of free societies, however one wants to frame it, engaged in 2 of the bloodiest wars of the second half of the 20th century in containing communism. In Korea, where Canada participated also, the Korean War, and in Vietnam. In Vietnam, Canada was not part of the coalition, but America fought in Vietnam. 57,000 dead Americans is the cost, apart from the treasury, that America paid in trying to contain communism, and the cost that America bore in containing communism in Europe. That is, the Iron Curtain and the defense of Europe through NATO. Okay, so what has Biden achieved? Biden basically abandoned Afghanistan. That was the first signal to the world, and in particular to Putin and Moscow. He handed Afghanistan after over $2 trillion of American treasury and several thousand American casualties, dead and wounded in Afghanistan, to the Taliban, with over 80, close to $90 billion of war material left behind to the Taliban that one can infer has been parceled off by the Taliban to China and to Pakistan. So now, who is or what is Afghanistan got to do with what happened? Well, Afghanistan was a clear indicator to Putin that Washington and Biden are basically weak players pushing their hands against Russia, and that this was the moment, finally, as the crisis built up. My inference is that Putin concluded that this is the time to basically end this festering wound and problem on Russia's immediate perimeter. And that's what he has done. Now there is the fog of war, and we don't know. I mean, the BBC and all the American media is talking about the immense resistance of the Ukrainian army that has delayed the advances of the Russian forces. And that's what the storyline is at the moment. As I look at those pictures, I see clearly that Russia is not interested, or that was never on their plan, to engage in the sort of what is the fabricated narrative of the Western media and the Western, that is the American government. This is Putin's shock and awe. That is the reference to George Bush 43's shock and awe with Iraq. And that shock and awe with Iraq was to basically level Iraq. That is Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Putin is not interested in any of that shock and awe and leveling it. What we can understand from the Russian side of the story, the little bit that we can get in this fog of war, is Russia has basically captured those industrial towns where there were the biotechnology biolabs for making bioweapons in Ukraine that had been put together by the Americans, and those have been captured by Russia. Russia has not gone into a shock and awe to level Kyiv or any of the cities, and it is encircling Kyiv, the capital, and we'll wait to see to the moment when the capital basically lays down the arm. That's what Putin has asked the Ukrainian army to lay down the arm, so that a denazification of Ukraine can begin. That aspect of denazification of Ukraine is a very relevant argument, because Ukraine was a divided country during the time of the German invasion into Ukraine in 1941 through Poland. And a great many of Ukrainians in the western half of Ukraine participated with the German army, became collaborators with the Nazis. The story of our deputy prime minister and finance minister's family is a glaring example of that nobody wants to speak about. So there is that element of denazification, because that element of pro-Nazi people became pro-globalist, and becoming pro-globalist, they are the agents of George Soros and the World Economic Forum and the Davos crowd, with which the Uniparty and the deep state in America has been engaged in, both in the corrupt practices in their playground, turning Ukraine into their playground, into their backyard. And Ukraine was the instrument of the first impeachment of President Trump. That's the playground, that's the backyard. Okay, so I think once the fog of war lifts, we will see that what President Putin was basically indicating, that he will not allow it to happen, it will be in some sense accomplished for Moscow, that a Ukrainian regime after these events will be a Ukrainian regime that will fully understand its position in relationship to Moscow, will be a neutral country, will be independent, apart from those two proto-republics that have been recognized by Moscow, Luhansk and Donetsk. The rest of Ukraine will be formed, established, a new government will take place, whether it's under Zelensky, if he survives, or somebody else. And on Zelensky, as a final note, the latest story out of Moscow, which the Western media is not reporting, is that Zelensky's people and Putin's people had begun talking to find a settlement, a ceasefire. And Putin's people indicated to Zelensky to go to Minsk in Belarus, where Putin would engage him. However, Biden and his people sent out clear instruction that the only people who can talk directly to Putin is Washington, that is Biden's people. That Zelensky has no right, no authority to talk about Ukraine with Putin. So you can see the handcuffing of anybody in Ukraine who would take a position in defending the independence of Ukraine in terms of Ukrainian interests, which possibly Yanukovych and Shokin, and indeed Zelensky possibly understand. So I have my worries about Zelensky in the sense that if something happens to Zelensky, the BBC and the entire Western media will immediately pounce on the narrative that he has been eliminated by the Russian, and we will not know, what has happened, just as we do not know exactly what has happened to Yanukovych, or where is Yanukovych.
Well, Salim, at the beginning of this conversation, I did say that it was a bit of a complex issue and full of intrigue, and certainly not a story that is being portrayed properly in the government press, nor by our government. In fact, whenever I hear Trudeau or Chrystia Freeland or the CBC and their ilk come down on one side, my inclination is to look into the other side as possibly being the good guys. Putin is not a good guy. However, as you have put it into proper context, there are influences, there are reasons, there are motivations far beyond what our press and our government is letting us know about. And I thank you very much for putting this into a context that I think is a little more easily understood by people if they listen to this whole conversation. Thank you very much, Salim.
Thank you, Robert.